figure we should get started. I'm sure Bailey and John have some good material to go over. I will just quickly share my screen to remind you all that this Lunch and Learn talk is sponsored by the Cienega Watershed Partnership. And we work to preserve Cienega Watershed, the landscape, the resources, the ability of people to live in the watershed, and the variety of resources. And hence why we've invited Bailey and John from the Arizona Land and Water Trust today to talk about their organization's efforts to preserve and conserve the resources of Southern Arizona and the landscapes in a lot of different ways. So with that, I'll turn it over. Oh, good.
So Bailey, would you like me to take it from here then?
Yeah, go ahead, John. And since we're a small group today, we can probably field questions as they come.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to have this evolve into more of a conversation, less of a presentation. So don't hesitate to speak up. And if I just get going and I'm not paying attention to your question, just I don't know, chat Bailey and tell her to cut me off. I'm happy to take those questions. So yeah, my name is John Barrett. I'm the land program director at the Arizona Land and Water Trust, and we're a local land trust formed about 40 years ago in Arizona. And all right, so yeah, and just so you know that this is laced with several pictures. I know most of these properties, not all of them. Sometimes I know all the properties we work on, but I can't always match photos with the actual properties. So I may not be able to identify all of these, but we are a nonprofit land trust. We're a 501c3 organization, and essentially what the core of our mission is to protect land and water resources. We work primarily with private landowners to put conservation easements on their properties, but we do also work with various federal and state agencies to acquire additional fee land for those agencies to, say, expand national parks or acquire in-holdings on behalf of the Forest Service or whatnot. And during that time, we've protected about 60,000 acres throughout Southern Arizona in combination as conservation easements and fee acquisitions. And about 23,000 acres of those are conservation easements. Bailey, remind me, we have some future slides coming up talking about the mechanics of easements, or should I talk about that here, you think?
Yeah, we've got some slides that speak to that, John.
Okay, all right. So yeah, like I said earlier, we work to protect land, and typically the main scenario that we work in is a piece of property will be owned by a landowner, typically a farmer or rancher. That's where the bread and butter of our work, and they will be interested in permanently protecting their land. And the mechanism by which a private property owner can permanently protect land is to put a conservation easement on it. And for all intents and purposes, a conservation easement is a set of deed restrictions that preclude future development or uses on the property. And a key feature of that is, and something I'll say over and over again, is this is in perpetuity. So conservation easements are typically permanent protections. So subsequent transfers of the property, those deed restrictions survive and attach to future owners. And we'll dive more into this, but we do frequently get the landowners paid for putting conservation easements on their property. And we do that by using a variety of federal, state, and private donors, federal and state public programs, and also work with private donors who want to pay money for private conservation. So next slide there, Bailey. Okay, so I did start down this, and people frequently get confused about these, but again, a conservation easement it's a creature of state law. So the reason that people can establish conservation easements on their property is because the Arizona legislature says that they can. And most states in the country do have statutes that allow for conservation easements. And there's usually, when I give these talks, I hit on a few key highlights of what a conservation easement is and is not. So first and foremost, conservation easement is a voluntary land transaction. It requires a willing landowner who is willing to sell or donate a conservation easement. and a organization like a land trust or the county sometimes on the other side who is willing to hold the conservation easement. And what I mean by holding a conservation easement is they have the obligation, that organization has the obligation to monitor the property, usually on an annual basis, to make sure the terms of the easement are being followed. And if they're not, they've got the obligation and the right to enforce the conservation easement, which is, for better or worse, a legal action. So a conservation easement can be enforced in the court, state court, in the county where the property is located. So again, the key point here is a conservation easement is a private transaction with a willing landowner. It is cannot be imposed on a landowner by a government agency, right? A conservation easement is not backhanded condemnation or some sort of restrictive measure imposed by the government. Something else about a conservation easement, and this is much of a myth, is some bad information that floats out there in the world. A conservation easement does not typically restrict a landowner's right to subsequently transfer the property. So it will restrict what they can do with the property while they own it. The main things are development and future subdivision, breaking the property into smaller parcels. But property that has a conservation easement on it can be sold, and it can be left to somebody in your will. So if you've got a piece of property that conservation easement on it, you still have the right to dispose of the property. Similarly, you can still you can use the property as collateral on a loan, but it really is up to the bank at that point whether they want to accept the property as collateral on a loan and what the value is. And as I mentioned before, a conservation easement is typically permanent, meaning it lasts permanently, right? There are term easements. We typically don't work with term easements, but a conservation easement is permanent. So when if a conservation easement is established here in 2021, unless there is something that happens significant, it's really not worth talking about here, there will still be a conservation easement on the property in 21. So they are permanent. And typically conservation easements, there are a variety of restrictions that can be on them. It really depends on what the funding source requires. But for our purposes, most of the conservation easements that the Arizona Land and Water Trust works on and establishes are really to facilitate, protect ranches, protect ranch land, and facilitate reasonable, responsible ranching into the future. So typically the restrictions that are on conservation easements established by the Arizona Land and Water Trust do not preclude reasonable grazing practices. So Bailey, you want to go ahead to the next one? So I suppose it's worth saying here that we work typically in the lower southeast 6 counties of Arizona. And these days that involves a lot of work sort of in your neck of the woods in what we call the Fort Huachuca Sentinel landscape. So several years ago, I think it was about a little less than 10, the Department of Defense, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Interior all realized that they had a common interest in protecting open space in what's called the Fort Huachuca Sentinel landscape. And this is an outline of that area where there are common interests between all of those federal agencies. And the outline is not arbitrary. It is actually sort of the rough outline of an area that has very low levels of naturally occurring and man-made electromagnetic interference. So if you look at this area from a satellite, and that satellite is imaging electromagnetic interference, this part of the world is just what they call dark. There's very little naturally occurring electromagnetic interference. And what interferes with that is future development. So that's what is the outline. But within that footprint of that outline is also a very important river corridor in the San Pedro, some very important grasslands, as you all know. So there's important water resources, and there are some very important historic ranches in this area. So these agencies that are all concerned about these things have all decided that this area is worth a common investment in land protection, and that land protection facilitates all of those federal agencies' larger missions. So this is a map of that area, and the dark green are conservation easements, not all that have been done by the Arizona Land and Water Trust, but this is the mosaic of privately protected lands that sort of facilitate all of the missions of these federal programs. So of these conservation easements, about 5,500 of them are ones that we established. This map's a little dated. There's a newer one that's not showing on this that adds about 800 acres to that total total of Arizona Land and Water Trust easements. But all told, there's about, I guess, about 2,300 acres now of easements in this area. So go ahead, Bailey, to the next slide. This is just sort of an idea for, this audience obviously knows what this part of the world looks like. People don't always, but this is just to sort of show what the landscape looks like within the Fort Huachuca Sentinel landscape. So the picture of the horses are the Baba Kamari Ranch that I suspect most of you are familiar with. It's a family-owned ranch just north of Fort Huachuca. And this area where these horses are is an area that's been protected with an Arizona Land and Water Trust conservation easement. To the west of Fort Huachuca are the Canelo Hills. That photograph on the right is at the Canelo Hills, which is a really important, ecologically important area just to the west of Fort Huachuca where we work. And then down below is sort of a picture of an aerial photo of Sierra Vista coming up, encroaching on the Huachuca Mountains. And that's just to sort of illustrate there is this interplay between development and open space in that area. And as Sierra Vista grows, it's encroaching on the fort and the area that's important to the fort. And so the Department of Defense does support conservation easement acquisition around Fort Huachuca to prevent more expansion of the city in these areas that are important to the Fort Huachuca. Go ahead, Bailey. So I thought it'd be good to talk about a couple of specific projects that we've worked on and just sort of illustrate, rather than talking about this, generally talk about this in the context of some specific projects. So the Rose Tree Ranch may be an area that some of you know. It's, Bailey, can you put, it's, yeah, the red project right there. It's just north of Elgin, and this is a historic ranch. The owners of the ranch have told me that there's evidence that some of the Spanish settlers actually grew, they had vineyards on the Rose Tree Ranch to grow grapes, to make wine that was then used for religious purposes at Tumacacri and some of the historic missions along the Santa Cruz River. But it's a historic ranch. In all told, it's about 12,000 acres and includes grazing leases. And it's a beautiful spot. And that conservation easement was funded by the United States Department of Agriculture through the NRCS and the Department of Defense. So this particular piece of property is now permanently protected with a conservation easement. That was, again, funded jointly by the NRCS and the Department of Defense. These are just some photographs of what it's like out on the ranch. These are obviously really significant grasslands. There's a old water impoundment that's on the ranch. Here it is. Probably looks like this right now. Some of the pictures we've got are in browner days. I don't know how many of you have been down to the Sonoyta area recently, but it looks extraordinary. It's like Ireland down there. It's just down there, a place called Rain Valley, which is sort of sandwiched there between Huachuca City and Sonoyta, and it's amazing right now. So a more recent one we worked on is known as the Pyatt Ranch. Again, it looks a little green on this right now. And this is a really interesting project just to the west of Fort Huachuca. It's fascinating that it's been in the same family for 5 generations now. And the landowner was really interested in preserving his family's legacy and making sure that the ranch wasn't developed in the future. And so the owner sold a conservation easement, and the Department of Defense through Fort Huachuca was very eager to protect this property since they are neighbors. It's not uncommon for drone pilots to crash drones there on the Pyatt Ranch, and Manuel, the owner, has on occasion helped people go find the drones on his property. But that was funded by the Department of Defense. Bailey, we've got some additional pictures of that one. You've got any more? Is there another one there? Okay, yeah, that's out on the well. Any others? Okay. So if you can go back to the map real fast on Pyatt Ranch, Bailey. This sort of segues into some of the work that Bailey does. So one of the benefits of conservation easements in this area is that there is a nexus between land protection and watershed health. And this is an area we're exploring more. And there is this idea that healthy lands promote healthy rivers. And so Lyle Canyon runs through Pyatt Ranch. And there is an idea or a sense that if we can protect the land around Lyle Canyon, which is a tributary to the Babacomery Ranch, which is a tributary to the San Pedro, if we can start protecting the lands where these tributaries are located, we can help promote watershed health, cut down on turbidity of the flow, maybe find ways to slow the flow as it flows into the San Pedro, maybe make sure that these riparian corridors are protected and the vegetation isn't stripped off. So one of the highlights of the Pyatt Ranch project for us was to capture this area of Lyle Canyon and help protect it. And again, thereby protecting the Babacomery and the San Pedro. So that was one of the benefits to this particular project, is to protect the larger watershed health of the area. Yeah, that's the owner out on one of his tanks, and wetter times, it doesn't always look like that, but he's got some perennial water on the property, and the static water table is actually pretty high compared to a lot of the places right there. Manuel was telling us a story once that there was a study done on the hydrology on his property, and apparently the rainfall that lands on the Huachuca Mountains when his ranch is on the base there takes like 100 years to find its way down to the actual springs on the property. And that may be some hyperbole, but it just sort of shows that the ranch and the connection between the water and the ranch there. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions there. Yep, Bud Greener, Tom just dropped in that chat. So that's a really broad overview. I know it's a lot, and again, it's a small group here today, so happy to make this a conversation. So happy to answer any questions about the land protection work that we do, or we can just sort of let Bailey talk more articulately about the work that she does, and then we can handle questions later. So whatever everybody's druthers is, happy to work with them.
I have a couple of quick questions.
Sure.
On your map that you were showing 2 or 3 slides back, wondering if you could point out where the research ranch is. Yeah, that one. Where's the research ranch now? Audubon Research Ranch.
Yeah, so that is, that's, no, Bailey, it's down and to the right. Yep, nope, I'm to the left, I'm sorry. Down and to the right, kind of like 8 o'clock. So where it says Pyatt Ranch,
Yeah.
it's right in that area.
Oh, it's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, it's right there. So that's the Canelo Hills, and the research ranch is right there off the road. So I can't point to it specifically, but where Bailey had the cursor, it's right in that area.
Okay. Okay.
And they're actually, it may border another ranch. So that green area above Manuel's property, the Pyatt Ranch, it's called the Diamond Sea. It borders part of the Diamond Sea right there, I think. So
Okay.
it's largely in that area.
Okay. And and pardon me if you didn't mention this before, but so do you have this is mostly Santa Cruz County, correct?
So that gray line that
Yeah.
runs north to south is the Santa Cruz County, Cochise County line, yes.
Oh, yeah, okay, okay, both of those counties, okay. And so do you work with the county commissioners in these 3 counties, and are they like amenable to supporting this kind of thing?
So that's interesting. It's a bit of a loaded question. I can see Bailey kind of smiling now. In Santa Cruz County, no. We are trying to build a better relationship with the commissioners in Santa Cruz County. I know we have talked to several former commissions, and I think more recently Bailey is actually talking to the government in Santa Cruz County about some of the work we do. Cochise County, we actually have a closer relationship to Cochise County because of the work. And in part, it is because the county is involved in the CCRN, or the Cochise County Recharge Network. So Fort Huachuca works very closely with the county and the Nature Conservancy on protecting land and facilitating recharge along the San Pedro River. We do land protection along the San Pedro River. And so our work sort of dovetails into what the CCRN and what the county and the fort and the conservancy are trying to do in Cochise County. So We don't always work directly with the county, but there's a lot of overlap and collaborative work that we're involved in with them. So Cochise County is very aware of what we do. We have a fairly close relationship with some of the commissioners and some of the folks who do work in the county on land and water protection.
Okay.
And John, are those in part motivated by the county's strong interest in sort of protecting the fort and its operations?
Yeah, certainly Fort Huachuca is the major economic driver in Cochise County, if not the entire state of Arizona. I mean, I've seen the figures on what the military installations do to the economy in Arizona, and Fort Huachuca is a major one of those installations. So yeah, people are generally aware of the importance of the fort. And there is an idea that Fort Huachuca needs the water resources that are there in Cochise County support the fort. Certainly, if there's no water, it's going to be hard to keep a military installation there. So yeah, the economics of the fort are certainly a major consideration. I can't say the primary one, but certainly it's part of it.
It's all wrapped up here, the water, but also this electromagnetic protection in the Sentinel landscape is about protecting the fort's mission as the flag for the Signal Corps.
Right, exactly.
Signal Corps training, which is really their prime mission, so.
Right.
John,
And
do you
it's
want to speak
interesting. I
briefly?
mean, you're a partnership, so you know this. There's a general sense that these partnership efforts make everybody more successful at their jobs.
Right.
And it's a really remarkable partnership. I don't know if the Army or the Department of Defense was very involved in land and water conservation 10 or 20 years ago in Southeast Arizona. And since that time, they've become a major catalyst for a lot of our work. A major funder of a lot of our work and kind of at the leading edge of some of these bigger conservation issues in Southeast Arizona. So, I'm not sure if those of us who do land and water conservation thought we'd be working hand in hand with the Department of Defense when we were learning our trade, but it certainly has become such that they're a major player and certainly incredibly supportive of all of our work. And maybe more in your backyard, we're working to establish a conservation easement on the Vera Earl, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with Ian Tomlinson and his work right there. And the conservation easement that's going to be established on his property is being funded in large part through the Department of Defense and its programs. So, they certainly are expanding the work that they do and are a major supporter of the land conservation work. So I know once we get an easement on the Vera Earl, that's certainly a win. That's a capstone land conservation project for sure for us in the region. And I know it's important.
In negotiating that Vera Earl lease agreement, or how does the Department of Interior leasing, BLM leasing figure into those discussions?
It doesn't really. The BLM is certainly interested in seeing this through the, Department of Interior is involved in all of this. The fact that there is a grazing lease on the Vera Earl or any ranch that we're seeking to protect, we get NRCS funding. And the NRCS or the USDA is certainly interested in protecting lands that have a larger grazing lease. So when we go to get funding for these ranch projects, if they have grazing leases on BLM land, state land, Forest Service land, that helps us score higher on the metrics for whether or not a project should be funded. So it certainly is a benefit to getting money. But once a project is obligated for funding, there's not a lot of interaction between us and whatever federal or state entity that, where the landowner has a grazing lease.
Okay, one related question. In the times past for land and water conservation funding in Department of Interior BLM, parcels were nominated from the bottom up, let's say ground up, and went higher at the state level, and then national level, national priorities were set. And everybody got together in DC and said, this is our priority. These are the parcels, this is the area, this is how we're going to use the money. Is that something that you're participating in with the BLM management and in identifying parcels to them that, hey, this is what we would like, this is what we're going after, we'd like to partner with you on that?
So yes, we do not have any active land and water conservation funded projects now with the BLM. We closed on one that was a BLM Arizona Land and Water Trust joint effort to protect about 500 acres near the Coyote Mountain Wilderness, north of Tucson, and that was Land and Water Conservation Fund, and we worked very closely with the BLM on that. We closed that about a year and a half ago. I think that's about when. We don't have any active projects with the BLM. However, we do have Land and Water Fund projects that are active, but it's with the Forest Service,
Okay.
not with the BLM right now.
Okay.
But we're applying for more, certainly under the current administration and that 30 by 30
Yeah.
initiative.
Yeah.
And then again, the permanent reauthorization and funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
Yeah.
It's creating opportunities for us. You know, just because it's been passed in Congress though and funded,
Yeah.
it takes a while to sort of trickle down on a programmatic basis. So it's not like somebody snaps their finger when the president signs the bill. It's got to make its way through the rulemaking and then the funding through Congress. So we're looking at some more opportunity in the coming years, but it's still a little ways out. We've got a couple projects that we've submitted for funding. It takes a while to make its way through the scoring process. So hopefully we'll get our first one funded next year, and then there'll be more opportunity in the future. And to that point, specifically with the BLM, I probably don't need to tell you, Sprinka and protecting the San Pedro Riparian National Wildlife Corridor, what I can't remember the exact, Sprinka and the San Pedro, the BLM is interested in protecting its interests there. And future land protection projects along Sprinka will likely be funded through the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
Yeah, they have been. Okay.
Yep. And I suppose the last thing I should say is to make it really clear, we're not the only organization doing this work. The Nature Conservancy does a lot of this work, similar land protection work. The Trust for Public Land does this same work. There's a group called the Conservation Fund that does this work. So, the private landowners do have options. Some of them want to work with larger national organizations. Some of them want to work with us because we're a little more homegrown and ranching friendly than some of the other land trusts that are out there. So, there is land protection going on in the Sentinel landscape that's not just being driven by the Arizona Land and Water Trust. Anything else? All right.
I think there'll be more later, but
Okay. Thanks, Bailey.
just like we should move on to Bailey and then have a larger discussion. So.
Okay.
That sounds good. Yeah, I'll talk about our Desert Rivers program, and then if folks have other land protection or water conservation questions at the end, we'll make sure to cover those. So as John mentioned, the Land Trust has been around for about 40 years. Our Desert Rivers program is newer. It's been around for about 15 years. And really the program was motivated by conversations that our staff was having with some of our easement landowner partners several years ago about what they can and can't do with the water on their property. How might they be able to conserve water without losing their right? What exactly kind of water right do they have? How much of it? What can they do with it? So we started to dig into these questions. We started to think a little bit more explicitly about how we might be able to address water conservation on our properties. So we developed this water rights handbook that you can find on our website that answers some of these questions, really looks at the Arizona water policy sort of framework that guides some of this management. And around this same time, the concept of environmental water transactions was gaining a lot of traction, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington and Oregon. And being a land trust that works on land transactions, we saw this model and we thought, I wonder if this could work in Arizona, this type of short-term water transactions. Let's see if we can give this a shot. So we started holding some workshops in communities, particularly along the Upper Gila River, to talk about this concept and see if there were folks that were interested in giving it a shot. And we actually got a couple takers. So the Desert Rivers program's 3 focused watersheds are the Upper Gila, the Lower San Pedro, and the Upper Santa Cruz. And as I mentioned, we had a couple interested landowners in the Upper Gila who wanted to see if they could make a short-term environmental water transaction work. So that's where we implemented our first about 6 or so water transactions. So to date, we've implemented 12 short-term water transactions with 6 landowners in the Upper Gila watershed and the Lower San Pedro watershed. And in total, we've, through these transactions, have conserved over 2,000, nearly 3,000 acre feet of water for those 2 river systems. That's over 900 million gallons of water. Now I'll talk a little bit more about these tools. So a short-term water transaction essentially is an agreement that we have with a landowner, and we have a separate agreement with a funding partner. So our agreement with the landowner is to incentivize them to use less water in their operations for a period of time, from a period of 1 to 4 years. Now, these agreements are structured to be less than 5 years, so they don't impact the landowner's water right. So the idea being that water that isn't used on the operation for that period remains in the river system. It's not pumped and applied to the field. It remains in the river to benefit in-stream flow and the riparian corridor. So as I mentioned, we also have an agreement with funding partners that help provide the incentives to these landowners. So in our early transactions, a lot of this work was funded by foundation partners like Walton Family Foundation and a couple others. In more recent years, our funding partners have actually been corporations, such as Intel has been one of our primary funders on the Lower San Pedro. And the motivation for these corporate partners can be a couple different motivations, but largely it's to offset their water use. So Intel, I'm sure you know, has a few manufacturing plants up in Chandler, and they're actually growing, but they have a really ambitious goal to offset all of the water that they're using in their operations by investing in water conservation projects like this. So if they can help facilitate an agreement with us and a landowner, where the landowner uses less water on their property and they're able to quantify that, Intel then says, hey, we've supported 1,000 acre feet of water savings on the Lower San Pedro to offset some of their operations in their manufacturing. So we have implemented 3 different types of water transactions with landowners on the Upper Gila and the Lower San Pedro river systems. These have been seasonal or actually in our case annual fallowing agreements, where a landowner doesn't plant or doesn't irrigate part or all of their pasture for either a season or a year. We've funded crop conversion projects, including one in the Lower San Pedro, where we, Game and Fish actually manages a property on the Lower San Pedro called the Lower San Pedro Wildlife Area. It's just north of Mammoth, about 100 acres, had been growing cotton and wheat. When Game and Fish took ownership of the property, they were interested to convert those crops to a lower water use native grass pasture that really supported pollination and wildlife habitat. So we worked with them to identify this native seed mix and to seed these 100 acres and irrigate them. And we've been tracking that water savings on that property. Again, that's a project that's been funded by Intel. So that project not only uses less water than the historic crop, but it actually provides some habitat benefits as well. And we've also worked to fund irrigation efficiency improvement projects. This is also on the Lower San Pedro watershed and a project, Double Check Ranch, where we helped convert from a solid set irrigation system to it's called K-line pod system. You can see that 3rd picture on the right there. A lot more efficient, reduces some surges and leaks in that solid set steel irrigation line, and applies the water more efficiently to where the rancher needed the water. They're able to move it around pretty easily. So again, all of these projects aim to get at mutual benefits for the agricultural landowner and the river system. So all these projects facilitate water savings while also supporting the agricultural operation. So that's something that our Desert Rivers program really strives to find. Sometimes it can be tough to find those mutual benefits, but that's really where our focus lies. We'll talk a little bit about some current projects and sort of recently completed projects in our 3 different focused watersheds. So first in the Upper Santa Cruz, we've actually been fortunate to have a grant this past 3 or so years from the Healthy Watersheds Consortium. It's a joint funding from EPA, U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, and NRCS to look at protecting healthy watersheds and keeping them healthy. So our goal with this project was to look at and prioritize land protection opportunities that could have the greatest benefit on the health of the watershed, the health of the river. So what you'll see here in this picture, this is an internal sort of conservation prioritization map that we did as a staff. So we looked at our mission and we looked at different watershed health criteria using EPA's Healthy Watershed Index. And we ranked those conservation criteria, those healthy watershed criteria based on our mission. And then we were able to apply that weighting to different conservation data layers. For example, critical habitat, connected lands, protected lands. And we're able to generate this heat map here that really illustrates where we want to be protecting land in the future. Not surprisingly, a lot of what shows up as dark green and of high importance are our stream corridors. So how we'll be able to use this map in the future is not necessarily to pick and choose properties because the trust works with landowners that are interested to work with us and that approach us, but really helps us make the case for any project that we want to pursue and pitch this to funders. So sell the idea, explain how this is important to our mission and why these conservation values are high for the given property. The next projects I'll talk about, which I already did really, is our Lower San Pedro projects. So we've just completed 3 active water transactions in the Mammoth and Deadlyville areas on the Lower San Pedro Wildlife Area managed by Game and Fish, and on the Double Check Ranch property. So we supported a fallowing agreement there, a crop conversion agreement, and an irrigation modernization project. So these 2 sites aren't adjacent. They're about 10 miles apart. But we do like to have sort of a string of projects that can support flows in a reach. That was actually the case for our Upper Gila projects when our Desert Rivers program first started out. We had worked with the landowner on a 1-year fallowing agreement. He had a great experience. He told his neighbor, who told his neighbor. So in that watershed, we really had a string of benefits that we were really proud of. And over the course of 5 or so years, we had 6 water transactions there in that reach of the Gila around Duncan, something we were proud of. Now this final project here in the Upper Gila, we're actually focusing on a different reach of river, so more in the Safford area in the Gila Valley. You might know there's a large irrigation district there, and they have expressed interest in modernizing some of their system. As you can see, there's parts of it that are in total, in some cases, disrepair. The whole system is about 100 years old, and there's plenty of places where modernization can improve efficiency and decrease losses to the system. So we're really trying to work with the irrigation district to help them accomplish some of these goals. And what we're introducing into the conversation is sort of the perspective of the river and ecosystem health. And we're able to sort of tie those recommendations, those points into the conversation that the irrigation district is having with, funding partners of theirs. And I guess we're helping to raise the profile of the river sort of in their argument for modernization. Now that project is going to be a big effort for us. It's one that's going to take several years and a lot of trust and relationship building, but we're doing what we can to work with the irrigation district and really identify some shared goals in that watershed. All right, so now I'm going to talk about some projects that are a little unique and sort of represent a new direction for the trust in some ways. So this project, you may have heard of it. There's been a couple news releases that have come out in Nogales International, and I think the Star recently, about this project that we're working to protect in Santa Cruz County called Sopri Farm and Ranch. Now this project is unique because the trust is raising funds to purchase the property and protect it. Once we purchase the property in 5 phases, we're going to be putting a conservation easement on it. And our intention is to then sell it to a conservation-minded buyer to own and manage the property. And that conservation buyer may be maybe a foundation, maybe an agency, it may be an organization that's really interested in supporting young and beginning farmers. And that's something that we really hope to be involved in sort of guiding that, but ultimately the conservation buyer will have say in how the land is managed. But what we're focusing on first is the acquisition of the property. So Sopri Ranch, we actually purchased a couple of years ago, and that is 2,500 acres. You see a strong riparian area in the ranch. I was actually out there a couple of weeks ago. It looks gorgeous. And there is a full complement of riparian trees in that corridor, which is really cool to see. Sopri Farm, it's about 1,300 acres, and that's the piece that we're working to raise funds to protect currently. So like I said, 1,300 acres, Sopri Farm includes about 327 acres of irrigated lands and significant irrigation grandfathered groundwater rights. So what's unique about this property is it protects shallow groundwater through Sopri Creek. You can see it flows east here to the Santa Cruz River, which I'm sure you all know flows north. So acquisition of this property and protection of this property not only protects the uplands, 327 acres of irrigated lands, but also protects these shallow groundwater supplies that are really important to the ecosystem here. So again, our aim is to hopefully facilitate a place where young farmers and ranchers can learn desert adapted crops, a place where we can sort of experiment with low water use crops. Because again, the Trust's motivation is really to support the agricultural heritage of this area, but do so in a way that also supports its ecosystems. So you can see here some pretty shots of the Santa Rita Mountains. You can see sort of off in the distance on this picture on the bottom right, a little bit of the Sopri Creek channel. You can see our irrigated lands here on the top right. And then this bottom right picture is one of our former staff members, Chloe Fondell, checking out the main irrigation well out there. And Chloe actually worked with Tom and a few of his hydrology students, part of the hydrology field camp at U of A, to do an initial assessment of the hydrology in this area and give us a sense of how water moves through the soil, how water is distributed across the farm property, to help inform some of these early management decisions. What type of irrigation system might we want to install on which part of the ranch? Where might flood retention occur on this property if it is to occur? So all of these sort of help in our early stages of planning while we're working primarily on protecting the property, raising funds to protect it. And the last angle I'll talk about here is sort of our newer focus on climate adaptation and sort of building resilience across the landscapes in which we work. So as John mentioned, a lot of our land protection, we're beginning to recognize this is protection of a watershed. And if we can work with landowners to help catalyze some adaptation on these properties, then we can build resilience across this larger landscape. And these conservation easements are in perpetuity. And with projected changes, we can't expect these easements to look the way they do in 100 years. So how might we support these landowners in sort of adapting to this change and maintaining the conservation values that we as a trust have identified? So we're working with partners at U of A and some other organizations to understand projected climate changes, and then also to hopefully facilitate some restoration and adaptation on the ground. And with that, I think I'll wrap up, and John and I can both take any questions that folks have got. So we've got a couple in the chat here.
Yeah, so I was wondering, one sort of more of a comment first on the Gila stuff.
Yeah.
I know that, I'm trying to remember her name now, Mary Jean Haney with the Nature Conservancy up in the Verdi has been trying to work with the irrigation districts up there to right, they essentially divert the whole flow
Mhm.
into their ditch, and then they start spilling it back slowly.
Yep.
And one of the concepts was just, you don't need to take it all up right up front, because you don't need all that water necessarily, because a lot of it, in most of these older irrigation districts in Arizona, right, most of the water just flows through the ditch and comes back to the river. Like a lot of it doesn't even get ultimately diverted onto a field or anything else. So I'm sure you're working on that, but and I appreciate the long relationship building that has to go into figuring that out. So
Yeah, I mean, that is the case, Tom.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the water is diverted and it's returned at these points, these kickbacks, these
Right.
sediment returns to the system, and any water that isn't called by a canal is returned back to the system. So you have this stretch of river between the point of diversion and these returns where it's often very low flows or sometimes dry.
Yeah. No, I've seen similar on the Verity, where the river is essentially dry, and slowly there's some groundwater flow, and then eventually these irrigation return flows or kickbacks that you end up having a lot of water again. But in the meanwhile, you have an area that could be very good habitat, not be very good habitat. So
Yeah,
and
certainly something we're working on. I think the irrigation district's sort of first goals are to improve some of their lateral gates within the delivery system, within the canals themselves. So maybe once that happens and they sort of learn the benefits of this modernized system, because not everyone's convinced, you know, it works fine, right? So as this modernization sort of begins to build some momentum, I think tackling the bigger things like the diversion structures might be possible.
And the hydrologist in me also wonders, how good is their measurement capabilities on this system?
Yes, good question. They actually use I don't think I'm saying too much here to say they use a DOS system to report flows through these canals. So it's a little bit outdated.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, I know at some, maybe in the spring when we have our field course up at Dead Horse Ranch State Park, you could come up there and take a look at what the state park system has there for their Hickey ditch, just to get an idea. Like you can have pretty elaborate measurement systems now to at least just know what the system is doing. Because I think in a lot of these older ditch systems, they sort of work. Like you said, people are like, they work. My fields stay wet. What's the big deal? But if we can get better measurements, we can maybe also, again, help them meet their metrics, but preserve habitat in the river and essentially leave everybody with the same amount of water and use from that water that they had before, but improve the value of the habitat at the same time. So
that's right.
I do wonder, you know, I saw that prioritization map for the Upper Santa Cruz, and I was sort of wondering about, right, essentially it was riparian areas were high priority, but I'm sort of wondering about these connectivity issues, and I see John replied in the chat, but right, and you sort of alluded it too in the Gila, where we're getting people in a contiguous area, but I wonder, like on the Upper Santa Cruz, so much of that land between the Socorro Ranch and say where Sonoyta Creek comes in is privately held or nominally privately held. About prioritization for that, or I'm just trying to, I guess about that connectivity issue about creating continuous strips of river and associated land that's protected. So
yeah, as John mentioned in his comment, I'll let him chime in if he wants, but that's certainly it's certainly important to us, and it doesn't quite come up in this small little picture, but you can see that those areas along Forest Service land and other protected lands do show up a little bit darker. So protecting lands that are adjacent to protected land, sort of expanding that footprint, wildlife corridor, and sort of the climate connectivity, if you will, the climate migration corridors and that sort of thing is certainly important.
Yeah, now that you mentioned it, I can see it better. Like when I originally looked at it, I basically looked and knowing the area was like, oh, it's the river corridors, but I can see that there's an underlying element of this like you said, preserving land near preserved land. So,
Mhm. John, anything to add on that front?
No, I mean, I think that's right, Bailey. I mean, we have to take the land ownership mosaic as we find it.
right,
And so there are certainly parts of these, major rivers and the various tributaries where the ownership structures evolved into be such where it's so splintered and so fractured and so sort of disconnected from the hydrologic reality of what's going on, that there's not a lot we can necessarily do.
right,
But that's not always the case. I mean, we do try to focus on those areas where the land does, grab a larger stretch of the river. So yeah, this idea of connectivity, it certainly is a factor. We can't always go for it. Sometimes, again, we have to take sort of the realities of land ownership as we find it. And there's not much that can be done on any particular stretch of river, but that's not always the case. And we do try to focus on those areas where we can have an impact.
cool. Looks like Doug, I guess, has a comment, or he may have a question. I saw him turn his mic on or off earlier, so.
Yeah, well, I just, that one of those, that area of the Sopery was an identified wildlife corridor that was identified as part of the planning for this Northern Desert Conservation Plan.
Oh, okay,
Great, yeah, and between Sopery Ranch, there is some other sort of private ownership in between Sopery Ranch and Farm. Immediately adjacent to Sopery Farm on the west is a conservation-minded landowner there, and another conservation-minded landowner just east of the Santa Cruz River that we're working with. And then you've got some state lands before you hit the Forest Service. So it's not continuously protected to this reach, but we're getting there. We're getting closer to protected.
yeah. Cool. Well, we're almost done with an hour. So I thank you both, Bailey and John, for a very good presentation.